Thank you, Noila and Alan. It was perfect. And speaking of perfect, Lorraine has set a very high bar for perkiness. And I'm not known for perkiness. But I'll give it a shot, I guess. So the topic is living your dream, and the monthly topic is work. And so trying to put those two together, living your dream in terms of work is whose dream are we trying to achieve in work? And so I thought I'd give a little history about that. We've heard of the work ethic, right? Well, the Protestant work ethic comes from the Calvinist tradition, and the Calvinists believed that mankind is fundamentally depraved. So this is from whence we came, is from this concept of being fundamentally depraved, which meant that you went to work early in the morning, all day, you lived a life of absolute frugality in the hopes of redemption in the sweet by and by. That's where we came from. Now, what was interesting, if you wanted to run for political office, what was required is you had to show evidence of abject poverty and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Very interesting, isn't it? So no matter what their background really was, the campaign was always showing how impoverished you were and how brilliant you were to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So this was the original virtual signaling, right, back in the day. So this is, our tradition of work and the idea of work ethic. Now today, many people complain that those young people just don't have a work ethic. Or this idea of you can't find any good help. And the other one is quiet quitting. Do you know what that is? It's where people are going to work and doing the bare minimum to keep their jobs. Now, all of this, I look at that and say there's something else going on here, because what I know is behavior is caused. So people are doing things for a reason. So there's no doubt that the social fabric is shifting in many ways, especially since the pandemic. And this idea of work has shifted tremendously with people having to work from home, learn virtual work with kids at home, and I'm sure it's made a lot of people crazy about work. And we've heard about the Great Resignation, which in actuality is turning out to be the Great Renegotiation, because people have recognized many things in the pandemic, but among them that they've been treated as less than. And this is more of what's actually going on in work, especially when people say, well, you can't find any good help these days. And a Calgary professor, Paul Ferry, claims that newspapers and publication at least once a decade for the past century, going back to 1894, had stories that said, you just can't find good help these days. Isn't that amazing? So it's nothing new. And so 1894, you couldn't find good help because, well, you couldn't hire slaves anymore, or you couldn't have slaves anymore. And then as it evolved, well, you couldn't take advantage of women in sweatshops. And then you had to get the children out of the factories. So, you just can't find any help to do these dangerous jobs that were really degrading to people. And I think there's more of that going on now. It's more of a social reaction to inequities that are becoming apparent to the general population. So there's more to it than meets the eye in terms of work. Who are you working for, and how can you achieve a dream under adverse conditions? My own background was, my dad was the first in his family to go to college. And all of the brothers and sisters were all blue-collar workers at one extent or another. And so my getting jobs as a teenager was working for uncles, or they would get me a job in a factory or something like that. And what always amazed me, there is a paradox there, because people always told you, well, you can become whatever you want it to be, right? You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you really want it, you can really get it. On the other hand, some of the factories that I worked in was piecework. And so I'd be on a machine and doing my piecework, and the foreman would come up to me and say, you have to slow down. You're making the rest of us look bad. So there's a contrast there about you can achieve something, and then the other side of it says you have to conform to this idea of work that we have. And so as a young person, what are you supposed to think? So there was always this churn about the dream. And for many people, the dream was simply food and shelter, right? I just have to get a job and provide for my family. And that was the extent of the dream. Now, in the 20th century, we saw new thought rising up with new ideas and new possibilities. You had Dale Carnegie, Norman Vincent Peale, what's his name? Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. And suddenly this started to shift the consciousness of empowerment. If it's to be, it's up to me, that I can achieve something on my own. But the workplace has not kept up with that to a large extent. It was still constraining people's dreams about what I could really achieve in work. And the best that people would strive for is maybe some form of advancement. And my dad turned into having a white-collar job and being fairly successful as a middle manager without a college education. So it's interesting and I'm sure some of you have had that experience, a different work experience than the promotion of achieving the American dream, which was family, getting a house, and I know many of us have. But is that available now to younger people who are making different choices about what work means? I've seen in my family, my son and his job experience, he's got a very good job with an aerospace company, and his friends are in computer science. And these kids, many of them are earning low six-figure salaries. And my son kids around because he's not doing quite that well, but he says to them it's like play money. And they're really quiet quitting. They're not really working in a place where they think they can achieve anything. And my son says to them it's like monopoly money. And that just blows my mind. It's a concept that I can't even put my arms around, that they have nothing more to look forward to than spending the money that they're earning. I don't know if you have had that experience with your children, but it's really eye-opening to see that, and to see that very few people are really motivated by this idea of dream. And if it is a dream, very often it's something that they see on their phones to aspire to by people that want to be famous. There was a poll out asking people what they want to be when they grow up. This is a fairly recent poll, and the majority of people said, I want to be famous. No, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, they want to be famous. So we're struggling with this idea of what is living the dream. Now, whether you're actively pursuing a career right now or you've had your career, there's still plenty of work to do. Would you agree? We're working on greater health, greater financial freedom, deeper relationships, whatever it is. So everybody is engaged in this thing called work to one degree or another. And the reality is, work is always a four-letter word. Right? It's either degrading and detestable drudgery, and you can fill in what the four-letter word is, or the four-letter word is love. Love made visible. Khalil Gibran said that, and this is the rest of the quote. Work is love made visible. And if you cannot work with love, but only with distaste, it is better that you should leave your work and sit at the gate of the temple and take alms from those who can work with joy. For if you bake bread with indifference, you bake a bitter bread that feeds half of a person's hunger. So we have this concept of work as being love made visible. How many of us can do that in our lives? Thank God for this philosophy where we can learn and practice, change your thinking and change your life. But for the majority of people out there, they don't have access to that. So whose dream are they living? There's always that paradox of making that practice choice of love made visible. I know in my own life, I look at that and I think, am I always living from that place of work being love made visible? And I can say most of the time, but there are times when family drama or overwhelmed because of situations at work or whatever it is makes me feel less than. And so how do you pull yourself out of that? Well, you've got to have a robust spiritual practice. It really just comes down to that. Because otherwise, it can be a vicious cycle downward that can just take you down out of your dream. And so if you really want to achieve a dream, a way of life, experiencing the best that life has to offer, you've got to have a spiritual practice. I don't know any other way around it. You can put your nose to the grindstone and work your butt off, as the Puritans said we must, but to a certain extent, to me, that's depravity. You know where the term nose to the grindstone comes from? Well, there was old Mr. Miller in the good old days, the guy that would ground the wheat for flour. And they would always look at Mr. Miller, and he always had his nose next to the grindstone. And what was he doing? He was trying to smell whether the grain was burning or not. But they always thought it was just because he's working so hard. So it became a term that if you want to be a successful miller, you had to put your nose to the grindstone. Isn't it amazing how we pick up these terms? The Protestant work ethic, nose to the grindstone. And we don't really think about the social implications of the work that we're doing, because it's huge. Sister Joan Critchler, an 86-year-old Benedictine nun and theologian, wrote a newsletter whose topic was the spirituality of work. And this is what she says. The most telling indicator of the spiritual deterioration of the Western world may be its distortion of the purpose of work. In this culture, we work so we can do something other than work ASAP, right? We work so we can do something else. A spirituality of work is a process by which you finally come to know that your work is God's work, unfinished by God, because God meant it to be finished by you. What if we saw our work as holy, as an expression of what we care about, an opportunity to create, to solve collective problems, and to give it to others? Our work then doesn't become a means to an end, but an ongoing ministry. Have you ever thought of the work that you do as a ministry, of being holy, of being sacred? The path of your dream being a ministry of greater health, greater abundance, deeper love, which is actually in alignment with the natural order of things. David Bohm, the physicist, would call that the implicate order of being in love with your work as part of the implicate order, where all of nature conspires to bring you to the highest of who you have come here to be. There's another book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass. Anyone ever hear of that? In that, she says that plant science have found that the human relationship with plants is transformed by our choice of perspective. I love that. It's changed by our choice of perspective. It is the human perspective that makes the world a gift. When we look at the world this way, both humans and plants are transformed. She goes on to say this: the relationship of gratitude and reciprocity thus developed can increase the evolutionary fitness of both plant and animal. Gratitude and reciprocity. A species and culture that treats the natural world with respect and reciprocity will surely pass on genes to ensure generations with a higher frequency than the people who destroy it. The stories that we choose to shape our behaviors have adaptive consequences. The choices that we make have evolutionary consequences. It's really a very profound statement, is when we look at our behaviors, recognizing that we are influencing what is to come. Now, indigenous people have practiced this, and I'm going to call it appreciative reciprocity. They practice it for thousands of generations. We all know those stories of being in natural relationship with all of life. So they've practiced it, and yet science is just beginning to discover this, that there's a natural order, that there's an implicate order, where things that are in appreciation, appreciative reciprocity, increase and unfold at a higher level. And we think that the science of mind is all that. And what I'm saying is we have to add appreciative reciprocity to the science of mind to really fill it out. It's much more than change your thinking, change your life. It's a way of life that engages us with everything around it in a certain mode of appreciation constantly. Can we really live that way? So people that have been engaged in this, in growing plants, have discovered that their plants taste better, produce greater yields with less use of pesticide or fertilizer, as opposed to the commercial production of plants that are simply exploiting a commodity, essentially, and then have to use more fertilizer, more pesticides. Isn't it interesting? And this is plant science. So imagine taking this concept of appreciative reciprocity into the science of mind to change your thinking, change your behavior toward all of life, and change the results that you produce. It's really very interesting. It's a new skill set that we really have to master. So if we believe anything about this philosophy, then we know that the access to this creative process is not denied to anyone, right? That's what we say. It doesn't have to be earned. It's a gift that's freely given from the universe to us to change our thinking, change our life, change our way of being. We are empowered to do that. Now, with that being said, we also have to realize that when access to safety, food, shelter, and a living wage is denied, then the evolution of consciousness is compromised. Does that make sense? If you're living on the streets, it's hard to change your thinking and change your life. Now, here's an interesting statistic that I'll wrap this up with. In the next 20 years, we'll see the greatest transfer of wealth that has ever been seen. Over $68 trillion will move from the greatest generation, the silent generation, and the baby boomers, to Gen X and the millennials. So all those brokerage accounts, the retirement accounts, the real estate, all of that will transfer ownership to Gen X and the millennials. And what they'll do with it, heaven knows. But it will fund a lot of dreams. And it's also important to know that people of color and other marginalized groups are hugely unrepresented in that 68 trillion and that transfer of wealth. That has huge implications for those that have, because there's a responsibility there. That means if we're truly committed to creating a world that works for all, A shift in consciousness has to happen that is away from fulfilling the narrow dreams of self-interest, because that's how we've been taught. If it's to be, it's up to me, and I can make anything happen. Well, it's like Sister Jones said, it's got to be for a greater cause than that. We can solve, with that kind of funding, we can solve the collective problems of this world. But it takes a shift in consciousness. And I don't know how to make that happen. But there is something inside of me that knows, and I call it forward in my spiritual practice every single day, that there is a way forward for all of us to empower each other and to make this a world where no one goes hungry, where there's health care for all, where there's shelter, abundance, and love for every person. The Buddhist said, set your heart on doing good. Do it over and over, and you will be filled with joy. So let's go into prayer. And here's what I know. That this living Spirit moves through each and every one of us powerfully and denies us nothing. That right where we are, the fullness of Spirit is expressing unconditional love, creative intelligence, and infinite wisdom to guide, inspire, and support each of us in our claim to want to create a world that works for all. And so we call on that inner wisdom, we call on that creative intelligence, we call on that unconditional love to inspire, guide, and support us in knowing the right action to take, and knowing that each and every one of us is uplifted, for we see the divine expression in each face, in each person, in each animal, and every aspect of life. We move into this place of gratitude and see that as we express that appreciation, it comes back to us multiplied abundantly in every aspect of our life. And we do it not to receive, but simply to evolve, to get a better idea about who we are and who we have come here to be. And so knowing that and claiming that for each other, we can look into the eyes of each other and see the beloved and know that we are on the right track, in the right way, for the highest good of all. And so it is. Thank you.